If you want to know how to memorize numbers, you might be getting frustrated. After all, there's a ton of confusing information about the main remembering numbers technique known as the major system, for example, and then there's the question of just how many numbers can a person remember, not to mention how to remember numbers with a memory palace. Well, I'm going to show you the major system that allows you to memorize numbers with letters and words, how to connect the major system with a memory palace, how to expand the major system into a P.A.O. or a 00 to 99 system, and explain what all those things are. In each case, the goal is to shift the burden of memorizing numbers to remembering fun and straightforward images. And this simple activity will reduce the cognitive load on your brain and make learning and remembering any number exciting and fun. So that's coming up right now on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Hey there, this is Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com, where we help mature learners go on mental adventures and use the full power of their imagination so they can learn and remember anything that improves their lives, from learning foreign language vocabulary and phrases, to being able to memorize passwords, to just diving into books and soaking them up like a sponge and remembering all those details. And so we're going to start this episode with some simple mnemonic examples of how to memorize numbers. And think of a nun in your mind. A nun, maybe just the abstract concept for now of a woman who is involved in a particular religious system. And in my use of the major, she is a very specific nun, and she represents the number 22. And there's a reason why. The thing with a lot of major systems as how they're taught is that they have a lot of arbitrary baggage, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I like to reduce the arbitrary nature to the smallest element and have as much concrete specificity as possible. So every time I see the number 22, I bring this nun to mind. And it's not just the abstract nun, it's actually Mr. Bean, played by Rowan Atkinson, dressed as a nun, someone I've spent a lot of time watching. So my brain has all the neural networks connected already, and it's just a matter of imagining Mr. Bean or Rowan Atkinson dressed as a nun. And there's a bit more coming up on why to do this later. Now I do this because I see, say, another number, which is 235, and there I can see an animal. Now I can see an abstract animal, or I can see animal from the Muppets. Which do you think would be better? Which would be more concrete? Which would be more magnetic? Well, it's easy for me to use the major system, which I think is better described as the major method, because it is a method that allows you to build your own system. But I use these principles we're going to talk about to add another image. And so when the nun now is interacting with either a tiger as an animal or animal from the Muppets in an unusual way, then I can think back and remember a longer digit with ease, like 22357, because 357 is the one that is represented by animal, and 22 is the one represented by nun. Now, there's a major system that underlies the remembering numbers technique that I use to do this, and you can use it as well. It's very simple. But to get to the stage where you can use nuns and animals, you need to understand why 22 is a nun and why 235 would come to be an animal. Well, the major system, first of all, has a number of different confusing terms out there. So some of the ones you may have heard are the phonetic number system, the phonetic mnemonic system, the number consonant system, Haragonese mnemonic system, or the major system, or major method as I prefer to call it, and many, many more. The exact history is not entirely known, but in a recent book, Mind Map Mastery by Tony Buzan, he attributes it to Johann Just Winkelmann. Others would cite Aimé Paris and Major Beniowski, and Major Beniowski is probably from whom we likely take the name major system. So it's not the major system because it's the one everybody uses, but because of this particular fellow who wrote some interesting stuff. Anyway, many, many variations, and you can make up your own variations based on this major system. But a large number of people use an arrangement something like this. So 0 would be a soft C or an S or a Z. And notice that these choices here, they're clumped together with 0, but soft S, C, or Z is all produced by a similar area in the mouth. So 1 is D or T, which is also similarly produced in the mouth. Then you have 2 is N, 3 is M, 4 is R, 5 is L, 6 you get a bunch of choices which are also collectively located in the mouth. Ch, J, or Sh. There may be some other variations there. 7 is a k sound. Some people would put in a hard G there. I never use that personally, but you could. 8 is an F or B, which is right at the tip of the lips with the teeth, F or B, and 9 is B or P. Now, how exactly to remember those associations is very simple. We've talked about it a lot before. Like 0, for example, could be a snake eating its own tail while it's sleeping, right? So S, snake, Z, snoring while it's sleeping, and then maybe Cookie Monster is reaching through the snake eating its own tail to dip some cookies in some milk, which is soft cookies, soft C, right? That's a way to do it. And there's multiple solutions. I would encourage you to use your imagination because it's great a brain exercise. In any case, in this way, I came up with images for 00 to 99. We'll talk a little bit more about how all that works, so you can do it too. But for 22, I went with none, and I knew that I needed to make it more concrete, so I pushed it and just asked myself, what could this be? What none comes to mind? For whatever reason, it was Rowan Atkinson. Maybe I have forgotten that I've seen him dressed as a nun, which would be a phenomenon called cryptomnesia, when you've seen something before that you forgot. But I don't have a distinct image of him being dressed as a nun, but nonetheless, it really makes sense to me, so I go with that. But perhaps you would prefer a piece of naan bread, right? Like you might really like certain Indian food, and so naan bread comes to mind. You just want to try to make sure that you have a vowel between the two consonants, but if that doesn't work for you, you could have a word like onion. That would also be acceptable. It's really up to you, but I suggest that you avoid abstract concepts. So for example, some people might think of noon. Well, how do you see noon, for example? I guess you could make sure that you have a clock with its hands pointed at noon. My preference would be to include Gary Cooper, who starred in the movie High Noon, to make it even more concrete. And maybe he's got the hands of a clock up his nose, and that is helping remember noon, right? Because it's now Gary Cooper who was in High Noon and noon. Another example, some people I've heard say, well, couldn't I use anon? And you know, it's not ideal because it's so abstract. However, if you wanted to use that for 22, you can make it concrete by maybe having James Woods with a particular book. Why James Woods? Well, he starred in My Name is Bill W., which was the origins of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So now your brain has these neural networks already established, provided that you know that movie and you know who James Woods is and you know what Alcoholics Anonymous is, and now you can just lean back in your mind and say, Anon, okay, so 2 N's must be 22. You'll get very fast and automatic at it, but when you're learning, you need to think back and rely on the system, which is perfectly fine. Now, I realize that this specificity that I'm urging you to take may require you to stretch your imagination, but it's excellent brain exercise. A lot of this is going to serve your brain so well. It's going to strengthen the neural networks, and ultimately this specificity is the secret to getting a solid 00 to 99 that we're going to talk about working for you from the beginning, instead of having to fuss with it for years and potentially give up, as so many people sadly do, because they don't know to be more specific and to push for specificity. Don't be satisfied with abstractions, even if you get started with them. So now, let's talk about how to expand your major system into a full 00 to 99 list. Because ultimately, once you have this system, you understand what numbers are associated with what consonants, then you can make a word for every 2-digit number from 00 to 99. This is very powerful because then every time you see 2 digits together, you'll have an image. So to expand the rules that underlie the phonetic major system is quite easy. I suggest you take it 5 to 10 sets of numbers at a time instead of trying to do the whole thing at once. But first, get a memory journal so you have a place to chart down your ideas on paper. You might want to even mind map each one so that you are doing it in a much more flexible way, creative way with colors and so forth. But overall, the best way to learn how to memorize numbers using this approach would go something like this. So get a memory journal for completing the creative task, and on a new page, copy major method, 0 being soft C, S, or Z, and 1 being T or D. Have that there for you on the page, and then on the opposite page, write 00, and then say all the numbers from 00 till 10. So 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, and so on. And then starting with 00, think of words that begin and end with S, because 0 is a soft C, S, or Z, or think of words that start with a soft C or an S. I just prefer to work with the one, right? So S or Z. And I personally use a guy named Thomas Zaz, who came up with anti-psychiatry. I learned about him in university, really fascinated with him and so forth. I have an image of him in his mind from looking him up in an encyclopedia, because back then there was no Wikipedia when I learned about him. But in any case, Thomas Zaz, that's who I use. You could use Dr. Seuss. Maybe you could use Sissy Spacek, or eyeglasses that you have that were built by the company Zeiss. There are many, many options, as long as they're concrete. If you choose Zeus, then use the Zeus from the Planet of the Apes, or get a clear painting or a cartoon of Zeus. So you're not relying on some vague concept of a god that doesn't even exist, right? I've done that many times by using gods and stuff that don't exist without having a clear image in the mind. It ultimately fails, or it doesn't work as well as it could if you be specific. Now, the next step would be to proceed to 0-1. And so for me, this is sad, and I see the tragedy mask worn by William Shatner in his performance of Oedipus Rex. And then the next step would be to keep going for about 5 to 10 minutes and take a break. It's important to relax and revive your creative muscles when you're doing this kind of work. And, bite that elephant one bite at a time, or eat the elephant one bite at a time. It's very, very simple, and some people, they'll just blaze through it. I would say don't get hung up on things. So I'm encouraging you to be as specific as possible, but if you come up with something that's very vague, then just keep going so that you get the list done, and then you can improve it later. Go for progression, not perfection, because there is no perfection in memory, because your memory is already perfect. It's just a question of how well you're using it. Now, to memorize numbers encoded with images in a memory palace, first things first, you'll need to know how to create a magnetic memory palace, and ideally a memory palace network. And your ticket for that is very, very simple. Just go to magneticmemorymethod.com and register for the free course there. And really, really appreciate being able to help people through that course. You'll see the homework that you have there on the screen. Quite a good thing for people. Thousands of people have gone through it, and I hope you will too if you haven't already. And if you have already, then why not take a refresher course? Next, start with your first magnetic station in the memory palace. If you use Dr. Seuss for 00, place him on the first magnetic station. If you used the sad tragedy mask for 01, place it on the next station. And you can do this and get more ambitious and work on larger sets. The critical point is that you use recall rehearsal to get the images into long-term memory. This is really, really important. Now, for many people, this step won't be necessary. You won't necessarily need to use a memory palace, because you can deduce, like Sherlock Holmes, what your images are by relying on the major. So, for example, I didn't learn my 00 to 99 using a memory palace. I only needed to think about the major for each digit and track back the image I chose. So when I think about 45, I see Superman bending a rail. And I don't have that in a memory palace. I never did. It's just like 4 is R, 5 is L, it's rail. What's the specific rail? Well, in Superman that I watched as a young boy, he at one point bends the rail of a train track and saves the day, right? So it's just, it's in a memory palace actually. It's in the location in the movie, but it's not in a memory palace dedicated for the 00 to 99. And when I created my first list, like I'm encouraging you to do, just get through it. Many of my images were not concrete enough. To this day, I keep strengthening them and find many opportunities to do so through practice. So for example, for years, I had a very generic idea of fire for 84, but I later evolved this image to Chuck Norris in Missing in Action 2 with a flamethrower. Now, I didn't invent this image, because there is a classic scene in the movie where Chuck Norris burns down a bridge with a flamethrower. At least that's how I remember it. And that is the beauty of the major system. By letting its rules set you free, your imagination will come up with many powerful associations, even if it happens over a bit of time. It's also really a great way to strengthen your ability to make associations if you need the developmental exercise. Many people do. I do, even though I've gotten quite good at this. People ask me, how are you so fast with mnemonic examples all the time? It's just because I keep showing up to the art and the craft and the science of memory and keeping myself nimble and quick on my mental feet, and you can too. So how do you now extend a 00 to 99 to a person action object system? So we've talked so far about giving each digit an image from 00 to 99 based on the major system. Now, many people like to have a triple whammy effect by having at least 3 different elements going on for each digit: a person, an action, and an object. Now, to be honest, I've never found this necessary. I've never even found it entirely useful in everyday life. However, in the world of memory competition, it is a must. Now that said, my own method of working often includes most of the person, action, object criteria. So for example, the 01 tragedy mask I shared with you is both a person and an object. It is the tragedy mask worn by William Shatner, who is the person. So it's an object and a person. Now to add an action would be quite easy. He could be soaping it up with suds. Now of course I'm making a leap of the imagination by turning suds into a verb, because S is a 0 and D is 1, right? So sud, and I'm turning now this into a verb like sud sing, but it would work very well. To take another example, I have Jim Carrey with a lyre, like the stringed instrument for 54. Now I could have him using it to lure something or someone to add an action to my person object, but I don't need the specificity for my personal memory practice, and in fact I find it very useless. It interferes too many times because I don't want necessarily Jim Carrey to use his lyre to lure things. Sometimes I want him to smash it on the head of the next number, right? So it's very, very obnoxious to have it be any one thing. I also sometimes have multiple characters for some of my numbers, or it could just be the lyre and not Jim Carrey in the context. So there's lots of reasons I don't have a full P.A.O. for each digit, but ultimately it comes down to that I prefer flexibility. And in real life, you don't have to beat the clock the same way that you do in a memory competition. You're also using the numbers you want to memorize for the long term, like banking info, phone numbers, and passwords. These are not random digits heard or read at an event that you're going to forget minutes after you submit the results. You want this forever, so you want your system to be flexible. And so to that end, I personally prefer to choose how my magnetic images interact with each other on the fly, change it, shape it, make sure it's as strong as possible for the recall rehearsal procedure. Now obviously this approach is different than the Dominic system, or Hotel Dominic as it's sometimes called, or the system that Ben Pridmore uses, etc. There's lots of people who've come up with things, Millennial P.A.O. from Florian Delay. Really brilliant ideas for competition. But at the end of the day, as incredible and mind-blowing as it all is, there's an even more incredible and mind-blowing truth, and that's Tony Buzan is right. The rules will set you free. So figure out the rules for yourself, figure out what your outcomes are, and then build the system that will support those outcomes. Each person always uses these techniques individually. You know, using Chuck Norris may be totally useless to you because you have no association to him. You don't have the neural networks in your brain associated with Chuck Norris and the flamethrower in Missing in Action Part 2. You've got to find your own path, your own pre-existing material in your neural networks, and you're so free to do so when you lean on the classic techniques and pay attention to the magnetic memory method principles I've shared today of being specific, being concrete, and pushing yourself a little. Don't just go with the first thing, but think about this. Use the power of thought to strengthen what you've got. And of course, you've got more to learn about this in how to memorize math, numbers, simple arithmetic, and equations on the Magnetic Memory Method website at magneticmemorymethod.com/products. But now that you know the options available to you, you can easily learn how to memorize numbers quickly, because learning how to use mnemonics for numbers is easy and fun. And now that you have these strategies, I suggest you go on to listen to my interview with Brad Zuck, because sometimes people ask, listen, how many numbers can you memorize? And he gives a great example. He explains his story, his perspective from the realm of competition and practical use of these techniques. He talks about grocery stores, he talks about outdoor memory palaces. He's got a very unique, interesting way of doing it. And he also talks about using the major for a mental passwords manager so that you can have great internet security. And I know you're going to enjoy that interview a lot, so check that out with Brad Zuck. Ultimately, let me know, how do these approaches to remembering numbers strike you? If you have any experiences you'd care to share or have any questions, post them, and you know, you've got this. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it for you. This has been Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com. Come by, get my free course. Make sure that you know how to create a truly magnetic memory palace by taking these wonderful principles of memory and really thinking them through for large learning projects so that you have the skills that matter for getting information into long-term life and having mental adventure while you do it. Thanks again, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.